Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute engineered precision.
Oh, absolutely.
Like you break your arm, you go to the hospital, and the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the black background.
Right.
And the doctor just points at it and says, there it is, that's the fracture. It's binary, it's clean.
It's deeply comforting, really, because human beings fundamentally crave that kind of linear causality. I
Yeah.
mean, we want to see the broken bone, apply the cast, and just, know the timeline for healing.
Exactly. We want our problems to be visible and isolated.
Right, but then you step out of the hospital and into the world of macroeconomics or national development.
And suddenly that x-ray machine is utterly useless.
Yeah. Or rather, the X-ray prints out, and instead of one clean break, you're looking at 100 different overlapping shadows.
Right. A shadow on the lungs, a shadow on the heart, a shadow in the bloodstream. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is just entirely murky.
And that brings us to the mystery we are unpacking for you today.
Yes, it does. So whether you're a seasoned academic, a policy professional, or just a curious learner tuning in, this deep dive is custom tailored for you.
Because you look at a beautiful island nation like the Union of the Comoros, stunning coastlines, rich cultural history, highly strategic geographic placement.
Yeah, and you have to ask yourself, how does a nation with such a beautiful environment get caught in an invisible, mathematically perfect trap? A trap where, like, every single attempt to grow only pulls the knot tighter.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. I mean, a nation's economy isn't a single bone you can set in a calf.
No, it's a breathing, highly sensitive ecosystem.
Exactly. And when that ecosystem gets trapped in a negative feedback loop, diagnosing the root cause becomes incredibly difficult because the symptoms start causing new symptoms.
So low revenue causes poor health, the poor health causes low productivity.
This no productivity causes low revenue. At a certain point, the causality just becomes a circle.
Which is exactly why we're diving into one of the most rigorous, unsparing documents I've seen in a long time.
It really is.
We have this highly specialized 15-page macroeconomic data presentation regarding Comoros. And it analyzes a sprawling 33-year period.
Right, from 1990 all the way to 2023.
3 decades of structural challenges, human capital evolution, and governance data. And honestly, just holding this report or looking at the digital deck, it sets a very specific psychological tone.
The visual design is striking.
It really is. Slide 1, the cover, is this stark, minimalist white background. There's a single dark gray vertical line acting as a visual anchor on the left side.
And a purely 2D geometric infographic in the corner.
Yeah, exactly. No flashy 3D pie charts to distract you. No stock photos of smiling tourists on beaches to soften the blow.
No, the visual austerity is totally intentional.
Yeah.
The authors are signaling that the subject matter is, well, it's too urgent for aesthetic fluff.
Right. It immediately signals that we're stripping away the narrative and looking purely at the raw structural mechanics of a nation.
And by the second page, the executive summary, they lay bare the core thesis of the entire decades-long data set. The authors have identified a distinct development trap in Comoros.
Okay, let's unpack this. How do they visualize it?
They map it out across 4 distinct quadrants on slide 2. You have macroeconomics, population and health, industrial structure, and governance.
And what's brilliant is how they use these simple gray dashed lines to circle the core data points in each quadrant.
Yeah, connecting them with very stark 2D arrows indicating the trends. It literally looks like the blueprints of a prison.
Wow, yeah. So the authors define this trap as a vicious cycle built on 3 main pillars, right? Low savings, low human capital, and low value-added production.
That's the core.
Now, if we're going to diagnose how this trap functions mechanically, we have to start by looking at the top-level economic engine. We need to look at the gross domestic product and the trade balance.
Let's look at slide 3.
Yeah, slide 3. When you first look at the aggregate growth numbers in this deck, specifically the constant 2015 US dollar valuations, it paints what looks like a pretty compelling success story.
It really does, on the surface.
You see a relatively smooth climb, with total GDP growing from roughly $395 million up to over $755 million, a doubling of the total economic output over 3 decades.
Sounds like progress, right?
Yeah. If you just looked at that one smooth line going up and up, you would think, okay, whatever the problem is, they're growing their way out of it.
But it's a massive illusion.
Right, because the absolute size of the pie only tells you half the story.
Exactly. A doubling of the total economic output over 3 decades is a genuine achievement, yes. But in macroeconomics, the more critical variable is how many people are pulling up a chair to the table waiting for a slice of that pie.
And when you look at the per capita GDP growth rate, how much the economy is actually growing per person, that smooth upward line just
It
collapses.
collapses into a terrifyingly volatile roller coaster.
The data visualization here is striking. The designers have placed the smooth total GDP line right above a bar chart showing the per capita growth, and the contrast is just jarring.
It's night and day.
The per capita chart is full of these deep negative valleys, and the authors actually drew bold red 2D circles around these valleys with dashed arrows pointing to a stark warning.
Extremely fragile growth, highly susceptible to external shocks.
The numbers are oscillating wildly. I mean, one year it's down negative 5.6%, another year it drops negative 4%, then it spikes up to positive 5%.
And recently, it's just stagnating at a meager 1 to 2% growth.
Why is there such a huge disconnect between total GDP and per capita GDP?
Well, the disconnect between those two charts is the defining feature of macroeconomic fragility. When your population growth outpaces your very fragile economic gains, the average citizen feels absolutely no richer.
Right.
In fact, during those years with negative 5.6% per capita growth, the average family is getting significantly poorer. Their purchasing power is eroding, their ability to feed their children is shrinking.
Even if the country as a whole produced slightly more goods that year.
Exactly. Because there are just that many more mouths to feed, that many more families trying to divide a pie that isn't growing fast enough.
But let's dig into that warning text. Highly susceptible to external shocks. How does an entire national economy swing wildly by 10 percentage points in a couple of years?
Well, Comoros is a small island developing state. They're incredibly isolated geographically, yet entirely exposed to global macroeconomic winds.
What kind of winds are we talking about?
They're heavily reliant on imported fuel to run their power grids, imported food to feed their population, and global supply chains for basic manufactured goods.
Oh, I see.
So if there's a geopolitical crisis that spikes the global price of oil, or if a cyclone wipes out a local harvest, or if there's a global financial crisis in the West, their per capita GDP simply plummets.
Because they don't have the internal financial buffers to absorb those shocks.
Exactly. No massive sovereign wealth funds, no deep foreign exchange reserves. They take the hit directly to the chin.
And that lack of internal buffer leads us directly into a massive structural vulnerability, the trade balance.
Let's jump to slide 13 for this.
Yeah, the deck uses a butterfly chart to illustrate this. It's a back-to-back bar chart that visually pits imports against exports.
And the visual discrepancy is almost comical if it weren't so devastating.
On the left side, you have these massive extending bars representing the import of goods and services. On the right side, the bars representing exports are tiny, almost microscopic in comparison.
And there's a dramatic, double-sided solid arrow drawn between the two sides, pointing out the sheer scale of the gap.
It's a massive hemorrhage.
What's fascinating here is that gap represents a deep, chronic trade deficit. Because Comoros must import far, far more goods and services than it exports, it experiences a constant, severe hemorrhaging of foreign exchange.
So the money leaves the country to buy necessary, unavoidable goods like medicine, machinery, and fuel?
Right. But new money isn't coming back in through the export of Comorian products to replace it.
But wait, let's play this out mechanically. If I'm running a household, and I consistently buy 10 times more at the grocery store than I earn at my job.
You go bankrupt.
Exactly. Eventually, my bank account hits zero and my credit cards are declined. How does a sovereign nation survive a chronic, structural trade deficit of this magnitude for 33 years without total economic collapse?
That's the million-dollar question. The only way a nation stays afloat with a trade deficit that deep is through external life support.
Life support.
Yeah. The domestic economy isn't generating the capital to survive, so it relies on capital injections from the outside. For Comoros, that life support comes primarily in two exogenous forms.
Okay, what are they?
The first is remittances, money sent back home by the Comorian diaspora living and working abroad, primarily in France.
Okay.
The second is international development aid. The nation's balance of payments becomes completely dependent on these external financial inflows just to stay afloat, just to maintain basic day-to-day consumption.
But that means those inflows aren't being used to build factories or universities. They're just plugging the hole in the sinking boat.
Exactly. When remittances come in, they aren't going into venture capital funds. They're going directly to a family so they can buy imported rice. So the money comes into the country from a worker in Marseille, goes to a family in Moroni, and immediately leaves the country again to pay a foreign agricultural conglomerate for food. It's a pass-through economy.
Which perfectly transitions us into the physical and financial ceilings capping their growth. I mean, if we know the macro engine is sputtering and the trade deficit is bleeding out foreign exchange, what's stopping them from just producing more?
Right. Why not build more domestic industries to replace the imports?
Let's look at their two primary resources, their capital and their land. Let's start with the capital.
We can see this on slide 5. The data on savings and debt paints a very grim picture of capital formation.
Yeah, the dual-axis chart in the presentation tracks total savings as a percentage of gross national income, or GNI.
And just like the per capita GDP, it's oscillating wildly. It bounces anywhere between a dismal 4.4% and a peak of 15.7%.
And superimposed over this oscillating savings rate is a prominent dark gray circle. It highlights a historic peak in external debt.
At times, the external debt of Comoros reached an astonishing 66% of their gross national income.
66%. And the text next to it explicitly states that this historic debt burden squeezed the space for converting internal savings into investments. Recently, it's settled around 24%, but that peak did immense damage.
Yeah, when a developing nation has an external debt burden equivalent to 66% of its national income, the sheer mechanical cost of servicing that debt consumes a massive portion of the government's budget.
Just paying the mandatory interest and the principal to international creditors.
Exactly. It eats the nation's total wealth.
It makes me think of trying to do a massive renovation on a crumbling house. You know, you need to upgrade the plumbing, replace the roof, pour a new foundation. But 70% of your monthly paycheck is going to paying off high-interest, predatory credit card debt from 10 years ago.
You simply cannot save enough to invest in the future structure of the house. You're entirely trapped in paying for the past.
That's devastating.
That analogy hits the core mechanism perfectly. If your national savings rate is fluctuating down to 4.4% and your debt servicing is eating the lion's share of your revenue, capital formation is mathematically impossible.
There's no money left over to build the deep-water ports or lay the fiber optic cables or subsidize agricultural modernization.
The financial ceiling is incredibly low, pressing down on any attempt to grow. The government is trapped in emergency maintenance mode rather than strategic growth mode.
Okay, so if they're financially out of capital, what about their physical resources? Let's go to slide 4. Comoros is a geographically constrained archipelago.
Yes, the land limit.
The deck gives us a 2D area chart showing the value added by agriculture, industry, and services over time. And the designers use these very muted, low-saturation Morandi colors, soft gray greens, faded gray blues.
Which almost visually reinforces the lack of dynamic explosion in the sectors.
Right. Now, the agriculture value added has grown over time. It climbed from around $110 million up to over $160 million in constant terms.
But there's a catch.
Yeah, the authors placed an upward-pointing gray arrow right at the 71.46% mark.
And that 71.46% represents the percentage of total land area currently dedicated to agriculture.
The text pointing to that gray arrow is absolute. Land development has reached its limit. Agricultural expansion is subject to the hard constraints of land resources.
This is a crucial physical limitation that separates island economies from continental economies. Comoros has essentially run out of usable earth.
Wow, over 70%.
When over 70% of a mountainous volcanic island nation's land area is already being farmed, you've hit a hard geographical wall.
You can't simply chop down more forests to create grazing land.
Or clear more plains to plant cash crops because the plains and the forests are already gone. Or they're on slopes too steep to cultivate.
Right. If you're Brazil or the United States, you can often solve an agricultural production problem through horizontal expansion. Just buy more land, plant more seeds.
But Comoros is geographically landlocked by the ocean.
So, logically, if you cannot expand horizontally, the only way to increase your agricultural output is to expand vertically.
Yes, and by expanding vertically, we mean increasing the yield per hectare. If you only have 1 acre of land, you need that acre to produce 3 times as much food.
But how do you achieve that?
You need massive inputs of modern synthetic fertilizers. You need advanced drip irrigation systems to manage water perfectly.
Mechanized farming equipment like modern tractors and harvesters. Highly specialized climate-resistant seed varieties.
Exactly.
But wait, To buy all of those advanced, yield-increasing technologies, a farmer or a nation needs capital investment. They need to take out a loan to buy the tractor.
And as we just saw in the previous chart regarding savings and debt,
The capital isn't there. The banks don't have the deep reserves to lend because the national savings rate is 4%, and the government can't subsidize the tractors because they're busy servicing external debt that peaked at 66% of GNI.
it's a perfectly interlocked trap. Without the financial means to modernize and expand vertically, the primary economic driver of the country, agriculture, is suffocated by its own geographical constraints.
You can't buy more land, and you can't afford to make the land you have more productive.
The physical ceiling and the financial ceiling meet, crushing the agricultural sector in between them.
Okay, this is getting incredibly intense. We've established that the capital is restricted by debt and the land is restricted by ocean and mountains.
So what's the third variable in economic production?
Labor, human resources. If the money and the land are tapped out, can the people themselves innovate their way out of this? Let's look at the demographic paradox on slide 6.
Demographics are often destiny in macroeconomics. The structure of a population dictates the structure of its economy.
The deck presents a population pyramid side by side with a line chart tracking something called the dependency ratio. Now, the total population is growing at a fairly steady 1 to 2.1% annually.
But what's the dependency ratio?
This is the statistic that absolutely stopped me in my tracks, the youth dependency ratio. This metric compares the number of children under the age of 15 to the number of working-age adults.
And what are the numbers?
Historically, this ratio in Comoros has fluctuated between a staggering 75% and 96%.
Let those numbers sink in for a moment. A 96% youth dependency ratio means that for almost every single working-age adult in the country, there is a child under the age of 15 relying on them for total financial support.
And just for contrast, the old age dependency ratio, the number of elderly people relying on the workforce is tiny, only 6.5% to 9.1%.
Right.
The chart actually uses a downward staircase arrow to show that even though this massive youth dependency ratio is showing a very slight, incredibly slow decline in recent years, the absolute number of young dependents remains overwhelmingly massive.
The text notes that this heavy youth burden dilutes economic growth.
But wait, this completely shatters a very common, often romanticized economic theory regarding developing nations, right?
Oh, absolutely. In development circles, we frequently talk about the demographic dividend.
The prevailing theory is that a massive youth population is a coiled spring, a potential economic superpower waiting to be unleashed.
The logic goes, if you have a huge boom of young people entering the workforce, they'll drive a massive industrial revolution. Their wages will boost domestic consumption, and their productivity will generate massive national savings.
We saw this exact phenomenon play out beautifully in East Asia in the late 20th century.
Right, the classic story of the Asian tiger economies. A young, hungry labor force propelling a nation from poverty to high-tech manufacturing in a single generation.
So if Comoros has a youth dependency ratio of up to 96%, why isn't that demographic dividend paying out? Why aren't they the next Asian tiger?
Because a demographic dividend is not an automatic geographic inheritance. It only pays out if you can actually educate that massive wave of young people, keep them incredibly healthy, and provide them with productive, value-adding jobs when they come of age.
Ah, I see.
If you cannot meet those three prerequisites, the youth boom ceases to be a dividend and becomes a crushing demographic burden.
Let's trace the mechanics of that burden. If I'm a working adult in Comoros and I'm solely responsible for feeding, clothing, and sheltering myself, my spouse, and 4 or 5 children under the age of 15, what does my household budget look like?
It looks like pure survival. That heavy youth burden forces the family unit and, by extension, the state to spend absolutely every cent of revenue on basic daily necessities.
Food, basic shelter, perhaps rudimentary clothing.
There's zero surplus income at the end of a month.
And if there's zero surplus income at the household level, there's zero aggregate savings at the national level, which explains the 4.4% national savings rate we saw earlier.
Exactly. The demographic structure mechanically prevents capital formation. Every new dollar generated by the economy is immediately consumed by the sheer volume of new mouths to feed.
It completely dilutes any aggregate economic growth.
It spreads the fragile gains so thin over a rapidly expanding population that nobody actually experiences an increase in their standard of living.
So what happens when that massive wave of youth actually ages out of the dependency bracket and enters the labor market? Let's jump to slide 7.
The vulnerable labor market.
The data gives us a deeply sobering answer. It's a 2D percentage stacked bar chart comparing formal, salaried employees against vulnerable, self-employed, and informal
And
workers.
there's a bold black arrow, right?
Yeah, a bold black arrow points directly to a massive block of color representing the vulnerable sector. Up to 72% of the entire Comorian workforce is trapped in vulnerable, self-employed, or informal sectors.
This means they're largely engaged in low-value subsistence agriculture or basic day-to-day informal services. The slide explicitly notes the danger here. This 72% of the economy operates entirely outside the boundaries of a formal social safety net.
Now, I want to push back on this framing for a second because I think a lot of listeners might look at a 72% self-employment rate and view it through a lens of rugged individualism.
That's a common reaction.
We hear self-employed and informal sector, and the modern mind often translates that to entrepreneurship. Isn't a high rate of self-employment sometimes a sign of a highly resilient, adaptable society? People hustling, making their own way.
I am so glad you brought that up because it highlights a very common, deeply Western-centric misconception about labor markets in the developing world.
Why is the data treating this as a catastrophic vulnerability?
To understand why this is a bad thing, we have to rigidly distinguish between what labor economists call opportunity entrepreneurship and necessity entrepreneurship.
Okay, let's break those down. What is the fundamental difference in mechanism?
Opportunity entrepreneurship is driven by choice and the pursuit of captured value. It happens when someone leaves a stable, salaried position because they see a lucrative gap in the market.
So they secure venture capital to start a tech company or open a specialized consulting firm.
Right. They're innovating, taking calculated risks backed by capital to create new wealth.
They're playing offense.
Yes. Necessity entrepreneurship, on the other hand, is playing pure defense. It occurs when an individual enters the labor market and finds absolutely zero formal, salaried employment available.
The factories aren't hiring, the civil service is frozen, and the offices don't exist.
So, driven by the immediate threat of starvation, they scrape together a few dollars, buy a basket of fruit from a local farmer, and stand by the side of a dusty road hoping to sell it for a micro-profit just so they can buy enough imported rice for their family's dinner that night.
They aren't innovating a new market. They're just trying to survive the next 24 hours.
And the risk profile of necessity entrepreneurship is terrifying because there's no formal social safety net, no unemployment insurance to fall back on, no robust public health coverage if they get injured. This type of employment is deeply existentially fragile.
One bad crop or illness ruins the family financially.
Exactly. If a necessity entrepreneur gets sick with malaria and cannot stand by the road for a week, or if a cyclone destroys the fruit crop they rely on for inventory, there's no resilience. There is no savings buffer.
They're walking a tightrope without a net over a canyon, and 72% of the Comorian workforce is currently standing on that tightrope.
Which perfectly and tragically brings us to the root cause of this labor trap.
Right. If we know they're physically limited by land and financially limited by debt, the only way off that tightrope is through human capital.
Let's look at slide 9.
Why is the labor force stuck in these low-value, necessity-driven jobs? The answer lies in the health and education data.
Human capital is the ultimate engine of any modern economy. You can have all the natural resources in the world, but if your population isn't fundamentally healthy and rigorously educated, you cannot move up the value chain.
We do have some genuinely good news to report here, though, on slide 9. Let's look at the bright spot in the data.
It's important to acknowledge this.
We see a very clean 2D line graph tracking mortality rates over the 33-year period, and the lines are definitively pointing down. Infant mortality has absolutely plummeted.
Historically, Comoros was dealing with terrible highs of 111 to 142 infant deaths per 1,000 live births.
Now, that number has dropped significantly. The under 5 mortality rate and the maternal mortality rate have also seen major sustained improvements.
And the designers marked this success with a large green downward pointing arrow.
Yeah, the text explicitly calls it a major bright spot in survival indicators.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, survival rates are the absolute baseline foundation of development. Health interventions are working. Children are living.
So logically, if infant mortality is plummeting, shouldn't that be a massive win for their future workforce? Doesn't that mean more healthy adults entering the labor market in 20 years?
It should. But this introduces the darker, hidden side of the health data on slide 10, which reveals the invisible crisis devastating the Comorian economy.
The deck uses a horizontal bar chart here to compare different health risks. And right there, highlighted by a stark red warning circle, is the data on childhood stunting.
Stunting is perhaps the most insidious economic destroyer in the developing world. It's a physical and cognitive developmental delay caused by chronic, severe early childhood malnutrition, often compounded by repeated infections.
The model estimates in the report place the current stunting rate at a severe 15 to 25% of the pediatric population, and historically it was over 40%.
We're talking about nearly a quarter of the country's children suffering from chronic malnutrition today.
This is why the mortality victory is a paradox.
Exactly. A child might survive a severe bout of diarrhea in infancy, thanks to an imported oral rehydration salt packet, which is a public health triumph. But if that child's daily diet lacks the critical micro and macronutrients required during the first 1,000 days of life,
Their brain and their body literally don't develop fully.
the architecture of their brain is compromised.
It's like successfully building the hardware of a computer. You source the motherboard, you install the hard drive, you make sure all the parts are assembled perfectly, but right before you turn it on, you irreparably damage the central processor.
That's a devastating analogy, but it's medically and economically accurate.
The computer powers up, it survives, but it'll never ever be able to run complex, high-demand software.
Early childhood malnutrition physically and cognitively locks a child's potential. A child who survives but is stunted will struggle to learn when they reach school age.
They'll have lower attention spans, lower memory retention rates.
And compromised executive function. Therefore, they will inevitably drop out of school earlier, and they will never reach their full human capital potential.
And when they enter the labor market, their cognitive scaffolding simply cannot support the acquisition of complex technical skills.
They're functionally barred from opportunity entrepreneurship, keeping them trapped in that exact low-skill, low-value necessity entrepreneurship labor pool we just analyzed.
And the data on education proves exactly what you just said. It perfectly maps the biological deficit onto the educational deficit. Let's look at slide 8.
The education gap.
The deck introduces the Human Capital Index, or the HCI. The infographic they use is striking in its simplicity. There are 10 stick figures lined up in a row, but almost 6 out of the 10 stick figures are colored in a muted gray.
This represents Comoros' abysmal HCI score of just 0.409 out of 1.
What does that mean practically?
Well, the Human Capital Index is a metric developed by the World Bank. An HCI of 0.41 essentially means that a child born in Comoros today will only reach 41% of their total potential lifelong productivity, compared to a theoretical benchmark where that same child enjoyed complete, high-quality education and full health.
It means the nation is losing nearly 60% of its population's potential economic output before those children even reach adulthood.
It's a massive, invisible tax on the future.
And there's a bracket on this slide highlighting a specific crisis within the education sector: learning poverty.
Right.
It notes that despite kids actually going to school, meaning physical enrollment in primary education isn't the primary bottleneck, the actual quality of the education is a severe crisis.
A staggering percentage of children, reaching near 23%, are experiencing learning poverty, meaning they are falling below minimum standards for basic reading comprehension.
They're sitting in the classroom, but they aren't gaining effective, fungible skills.
Because schooling doesn't automatically equal learning. Physical presence in a building is not an education. If the teachers are severely underpaid and frequently absent, if there are no modern textbooks, or, frankly, if the children sitting at the desks are suffering from the cognitive effect of stunting we just discussed, no actual learning happens.
The education quality crisis means that going to school doesn't provide an escape route from the subsistence agricultural fields.
The diploma is hollow.
And we can't ignore the physical environment these kids are trying to learn in. Slide 11 features 3 circular progress bars related to environmental infrastructure.
And one of them is fully loaded at 100%.
Yeah, but it's catastrophic, 100%. An alarming 100% of the population is exposed to PM 2.5 air pollution that exceeds the World Health Organization guidelines. There's a stark gray arrow pointing right to the center of that circle.
And the other progress bars show that access to safely managed drinking water and basic sanitation, specifically noting the elimination of open defecation in rural areas, remain critically incomplete.
How does this environmental data connect back to the economic engine?
When 100% of your population is exposed to severe PM 2.5 particulate matter, it's not just an environmental issue. It's an economic tax. It triggers chronic respiratory issues, pediatric asthma, and cardiovascular stress.
And what happens when a stunted child with asthma lacks clean drinking water and gets a waterborne illness?
They miss school. Chronic absenteeism exacerbates the learning poverty. The human capital index drops further. The environmental degradation physically prevents the workforce from upgrading its skills.
Okay, let's step back and look at the board. We've diagnosed the macro instability and the massive trade deficit. We've seen the geographical limits suffocating agriculture and the debt squeezing the capital.
And we've mapped the crippling demographic burden of a 96% youth dependency ratio and uncovered the devastating human capital crisis.
Right, so if I'm a listener, my immediate logical thought is, this is terrible, but the solutions are obvious. Build modern water treatment plants. Import highly nutritious fortified food for toddlers. Hire better trained teachers and pay them a premium.
That is the most rational question to ask.
Why can't the government just borrow money or use international development aid to fix them?
If you know the house is falling apart, why don't you just hire a contractor to fix it?
Exactly.
And that question brings us to the most difficult, intractable quadrant of the development trap, the governance bottleneck. Let's look at slide 12.
Okay, slide 12. The authors use a minimalist 2D radar chart, sometimes called a spider chart, to measure the institutional capacity of the Comorian state. It evaluates 6 different global governance indicators.
Things like rule of law, voice and accountability, and political stability.
But there is a dashed line specifically singling out 2 metrics that are clustered incredibly close to the very center of the web, meaning they have the absolute lowest possible scores.
Those 2 metrics are government effectiveness and regulatory quality.
The numbers are deeply sobering. Government effectiveness hovers miserably in the 0 to 12.7 percentile globally.
Think about what that practically means. Out of 100 countries evaluated worldwide, the administrative effectiveness of the Comorian state ranks in the bottom 12.
Corruption control is also stuck in the bottom 10 to 30 percentile, with wildly fluctuating political stability.
This raises an important question. How do you enact change without a vehicle?
You don't.
And that is the ultimate tragedy of the development trap. This administrative bottleneck is why simply throwing money at the problem fails entirely.
Okay, let's play out my hypothetical. Let's say the international community recognizes the stunting crisis and grants Comoros $50 million specifically to improve early childhood nutrition and build rural clinics.
Okay, the capital problem is solved. The money is in the bank.
Yes, but the money enters a bureaucracy operating in the 10th percentile of effectiveness. What happens mechanically?
The state lacks the sheer bureaucratic capacity to efficiently issue the complex procurement contracts needed to build the clinics. They lack the regulatory quality to ensure the imported fortified food meets safety standards.
Oh, wow.
They lack the auditing mechanisms to track where the $50 million actually goes, meaning significant portions evaporate through corruption or simple administrative friction.
And they lack the logistical capacity to monitor whether the nurses are actually showing up to the rural clinics once they're built.
So the administrative friction is so high that the kinetic energy of the aid is entirely lost as heat before it ever reaches the stunted child.
Precisely. Even when foreign direct investment or international aid arrives, the state lacks the sheer bureaucratic and regulatory capacity to translate that money into actual schools, hospitals, and infrastructure.
The bottleneck chokes off the potential of external aid. You cannot build a 21st century human capital infrastructure using a 10th percentile administrative vehicle.
Which brings us to the climax of this entire presentation. Slide 14. For me, this is the absolute aha moment of the deep dive.
Synthesizing the trap.
The authors present a 2D causal loop diagram made of simple boxes and straight arrows. It visualizes the hysteresis.
It proves mathematically that none of these data points exist in isolation. They are entirely codependent.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's walk through this loop together, tracing the causal mechanics step by step. You start at the top box. High population growth requires massive social investment.
The arrow points to the next box. But debt is high and savings are low.
The arrow points down, and government effectiveness is too low to allocate what little exists.
This results in terrible education quality, with an HCI of 0.41.
The arrow points left, so the labor force is unskilled, falling into vulnerable agriculture.
The arrow points up,
Right.
which keeps value added low, preventing savings.
And boom, the arrow points right back to the top box. The high youth population still needs investment, but the savings are still low. The loop repeats. It's a perfectly sealed, self-perpetuating circuit of economic stagnation.
Once a nation falls into this specific causal loop, the internal momentum required to break out of it is almost impossible to generate organically, because every attempt to fix one node is immediately undermined by the failure of the adjacent node. But notice the visual anchor in the center of the diagram.
Yes. Sitting dead center in the middle of this vicious circle is a bold text box. It's labeled simply breaking point.
And there are short arrows pointing specifically to human capital and governance effectiveness.
The authors are making a definitive diagnostic claim here. They're saying you cannot break this cycle by merely trying to tweak the macroeconomic symptoms.
These are the only ways to shatter the loop. You must fundamentally engineer a higher quality of human capital, and you must radically increase governance capacity.
So we have the diagnosis and we have the target nodes. What is the actual prescription? Let's turn to the final piece of the puzzle. The playbook for the future on slide 15.
This is where the grim diagnostic data must be translated into actionable policy.
The final slide lays out 3 strict, academically rigorous policy recommendations. The visual design returns to that clean, authoritative aesthetic, a 3-column layout, separated by minimalist vertical lines. Each point is bulleted with a solid black right-pointing triangle.
What are the 3 pillars?
Pillar number 1, invest in early human capital. The text specifically demands targeted, aggressive interventions against childhood stunting and learning poverty. You must fix the Moto 0.41 HCI bottleneck. You have to feed the toddlers and teach the kids to read.
That aligns perfectly with the breaking point diagram.
Pillar number 2, institutional capacity building. The policy states that government effectiveness must break out of the 10th percentile to attract real, productive foreign direct investment.
You need a functional vehicle. You need a civil service that can execute a budget and enforce legal contracts.
And finally, pillar number 3, agricultural modernization and economic diversification. Since we know from the data that physical land expansion is impossible, the policy mandates a forceful transition from low-value subsistence farming to medium-value added farming.
Now, what is absolutely crucial for listeners to understand is that these 3 recommendations aren't just nice-to-haves. They are sequential imperatives.
Sequential imperatives, meaning they mechanically rely on each other to function.
Exactly. You cannot modernize agriculture and transition to medium value-added processing if your workforce is suffering from learning poverty and cannot read the complex instruction manuals for the new mechanized irrigation technology.
And you cannot build the rural clinics and advanced schools required to fix that learning poverty if your government bureaucracy lacks the basic capacity to execute a public works budget.
The human capital and the governance are the absolute prerequisites. You have to build the brain, build the vehicle, and then drive the economy.
It's a profound, incredibly dense web. Every single thread pulls on another. The demographics dictate the savings rate. The savings dictate the capital investments.
The investments dictate the health infrastructure. The health dictates the cognitive skills.
And the skills dictate the industrial output, while the government oversees the friction of the entire machine. Well, to you, our listener, I want to thank you for sticking with us through this intense data-driven journey through the structural realities of Comoros.
It's a heavy, demanding topic.
It is, but understanding the profound interconnectivity of demographics, health, and governance is the only way we can actually comprehend how nations genuinely develop or why they remain trapped in the cycle.
By seeing exactly how the gears of the trap interlock, we can start to see where the leverage points for real solutions actually exist.
I couldn't agree more. So before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final concept to mull over. If a nation is truly caught in a perfectly sealed causal loop of low savings leading to low skills leading to low output, can a country actually pull itself out by pulling just one internal lever, like focusing purely on child nutrition? Or does the momentum to break the wheel strictly have to come from massive, sustained outside intervention?
It's a tough question.
It really is. Think about that the next time you look at a simple GDP growth chart. Does that one line show you the whole picture, or are you just looking at the shadow of a much deeper, more complex trap? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.